I have been managing a series of family-scale vegetable gardens for a while now, and I've been using them to explore a range of different integrated growing methods or approaches. I've been trying to give each method the benefit of the doubt and trying to make the most out of the techniques and philosophies that are collected within each method, and to adapt them to my context as well as to my own personality and work habits. I'm often asked the question about which one is the best, about which garden has been most successful. And this is a perfectly reasonable question, and one that assumes that there might be a simple answer, which is what I originally thought there might be. But these days I tend to respond that there are pros and cons to each of the methods. A more refined version of that question that I'm occasionally asked is, if I could only pick one method to use, which one would I choose? And there's a simple answer to that question, an answer that is based more on the context or the resources that might be available, and a more nuanced or complex answer. The simple answer to this question is the polytunnel garden. If I had to choose only one of the 7 family-scale gardens that I've been managing and abandon all the others, I would stick with the garden that is fully covered with a piece of plastic stretched over a metal frame. I've found that within this maritime climate in the Midlands of Ireland, with generally moderate temperatures and quite windy conditions, a polytunnel is the most effective intervention that I can make in order to improve what I can get out of the vegetable garden. Within this more controlled microclimate, I can easily produce twice the amount of vegetables that I can in the same area of any of the outside gardens. And I get to grow lots of the heat-loving crops such as tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers, which would not necessarily be successful outside. I've also found that I can produce food all year round in this space, and it is especially valuable for crops to fill the hunger gap of late spring and early summer, when supplies would otherwise be quite low. The higher yield, diversity, and better quality of what I can grow makes the extra work that I have to put in to manage this controlled environment more than worth it. And it's also a much nicer space for me to be in for most of the year, and therefore I generally prefer to work in this garden, which is a very important factor. So, the polytunnel garden is a simple answer to the challenge of only picking one of the approaches I am trialing. But if I had to choose between the 6 other outside gardens, my selection would really depend on the context and what resources I had available. If space was a limiting issue, or I needed to grow as much as I could in a limited space, then I would probably choose an approach quite similar to the intensive garden. With limited space, I would want to put in lots of time and resources in order to get as much out of the garden as I could. This would include double digging the beds to remove layers of rocks and debris that are often found in a lot of older back gardens and urban contexts, and these are the types of locations where space would be a key limiting factor. This method is quite time and labor intensive, but potentially really productive, as the double digging and addition of lots of compost creates a much deeper and more friable volume of topsoil that can support a much more abundant growth above. And I guess I really still like working with loose friable soil like this. But in order to use this method, I would also have to have a steady supply of large amounts of good quality compost, probably more than I would typically produce myself. If I did have access to large quantities of compost and still wanted to make the most of a smaller area of land, I could follow the methods of the no-dig garden instead. Although I have struggled with other versions of this no-dig approach to managing a vegetable garden in the past, it is finally showing promise, but only since I started buying in the volume of compost that I needed. Because of the huge amount of fertility that is added to the surface of the soil using this method, it is possibly as productive as the intensive garden, and with a lot less of the hard work of digging, especially if I can get somebody else to do the equally hard work of making the compost. But I would also want to make sure that the existing soil beneath the garden was clear of debris or things that could restrict the growth of the plant roots deep into the subsoil. And I would need to be able to start the garden quite a bit of time before I wanted to start growing, ideally the year before. It is not a method that I would use if I wanted or needed to start growing right away, but if I could wait and was planning ahead and had a secure supply of as much good quality compost as I needed and loads of cardboard and was starting with reasonably good soil conditions, then I would definitely choose a no-dig method. But outside of those conditions, I'm not sure I would take this approach, to start with at least. And for my context, the amount of compost needed would probably be the main limiting factor. I'm also not sure if I would select the polyculture garden, mainly because I've struggled with this method over the years. I still think that the strategy of integrating plants rather than separating them is potentially very useful and highly productive, perhaps quite a bit more so than any of the other gardens. The possibilities and potential benefits of interaction are fascinating, but I feel that this approach needs more attention and time than I've been able to give it. But if I had a garden right beside my house where I was able to give it frequent attention and I had the time and capacity to go deep into the explorations and to work through the challenges, this would probably be the method I would choose. I think this polyculture approach offers a chance to learn and explore a lot more than in the other gardens, and in ways I really like that challenge. I think I would only select the simple garden in very different contexts to the polyculture garden. I would probably only use this constrained but integrated approach if I didn't have a lot of time to manage a garden, or if the site was farther away and I could only work on it occasionally. In this context, it would be a great way to provide an abundance of food for winter storage, with limited amounts of work compared to the other gardens and fewer visits required. But I would also want to have some other source of fresh local vegetables for the rest of the year, either from another garden that I manage in another location or from a local market or farmer. I do also have a perennial garden, which I don't talk about very often, mainly because I've largely neglected it over the past few years for a variety of reasons. It still produces food, though mainly fruit, and I am interested in exploring productive landscapes that aren't based on annual vegetables, though I think the possibilities of this strategy are more limited in this climate. If I had access to a much larger area of land that was suitable for developing into a woodland or forest garden, I'd definitely be interested in exploring the use of more perennials in a garden, but at this point, I would not select it as the only method I would use. If I had to pick just one garden to use in my current context, and it had to be one of the outside gardens, then I would probably continue with the methods that I'm using in the extensive garden. I currently have access to enough land, which avoids the pressure to intensify the growing conditions. I've found the extensive garden has a simple layout, and the amount of work to establish the garden, maintain the growing spaces, weed and care for the crops is generally less than in the other gardens, with the possible exception of the no-dig garden. I've also found that this extensive approach is more resilient, but it is designed with resilience in mind, though it is not without its issues. This method suits the amount of compost that I can naturally make in a season, and I can currently buy in and easily store the concentrated amendments and fertility sources that I would need for several years. I can also get access to detailed soil testing so that I can calculate how much of each of the amendments are needed in the soil in each season, and the whole process generally suits the way that my brain works. But if I couldn't get access to soil testing or buy the amendments, or if land was scarce, then I would likely change the approach that I would use. But I would possibly go out of my way to get access to these resources, as I've found that the vegetables produced in the extensive garden can be tastier than from the other gardens, which means that they might be more nutritious, and that is reason enough to choose this method as the only one I would use. So, if I could only choose one of the 7 methods that I'm trialing, I would select either the polytunnel garden or the extensive garden. But of course this is a false choice, as in reality I would likely choose the best aspects of all the different methods and to mix them up. And I expect that I would continue to grow a lot more food than just what a family would need, and grow in larger spaces or multiple spaces. I think I would end up using aspects from all the different methods, a hybrid method depending on the stage of development and the type of crops. I would probably start a space with the simple garden approach, then use the double digging and the soil cleaning and building strategies of the intensive garden, and then shift to the no-dig method for longer-term management. And I would be taking regular soil tests of all the different parts of the land and remineralizing if I could still get access to these resources. I would have at least one polytunnel, of course, where I would explore intercropping and polyculture possibilities to maximize the use of this high-value growing space. The outside spaces would be divided into an area for large-scale storage crops, another area for high-value medium rotation crops, and a space dedicated to high rotation and quick-growing salad crops, as well as spaces for seed saving and other explorations. And I'd also grow a lot of productive perennial plants in the edges and spaces around the gardens, partially to serve as windbreaks. All of this is essentially what I'm working towards in my larger scale black plot, in which I'm currently only managing the larger polytunnel. In this one larger space, with enough time, I would be doing more and diversifying in ways that I would not work well in the family scale gardens, and I'd be feeding a lot more people. And I'm so glad that I continue to have the opportunity to explore all these different methods for managing a vegetable garden, as it allows me to be able to mix and match to adapt to whatever context I might find myself in the future. And there's so much more to learn. In these strange and problematic times, I feel that there's not enough people who have the skills and capacity to be able to grow local food for themselves and others in their community. And personally, I feel the pressure and the opportunity to help fill that gap to be able to grow more food for my own community. And at the same time, I feel that it's very important to continue with the explorations and development of this Red Gardens project and to make videos about many of the things that I'm learning and exploring to share with the outside world. So I find myself in this interesting position of being pulled both towards the hyper-local and towards the global, and that's a strange place to be in. But right now, I feel that it's far more important to focus on the global, to be part of that movement, to allow more people to develop the skills and abilities to be able to grow more of their own food for themselves and their communities. Because I feel that's what's needed in the world right now. If you'd like to support me in this project, I'd really appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon page linked here or in the description below, or my PayPal account. As the more funding I can get from people like you, the more I can explore and the more videos that I can make about it all. But most importantly, thank you for watching.